Okay, makes sense. And do you think, will inflation continue to come down, or do you see it being a risk of it staying at these levels or even higher moving into the future?
Let me make like a Jesuit priest. I'm going to answer your question with another question. Um, what do you think that you're buying today will be cheaper in a year's time? Especially now
Yeah.
that we're slapping tariffs, because you're calling me from London, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and now you've got all European countries slapping tariffs on all the Chinese goods. So it seems to me that pretty much anything you import from China, which today is a lot, is going to be more expensive a year from now. If you live in Europe, if you live in the United States, anything you import from China is going to be more expensive. I tend to believe that foodstuffs and energy will be more expensive because we've underinvested in those entire supply chains. So, I think that will be more expensive. So, yeah, then you're left with the services, healthcare, insurance, education. But somehow these continue to, like, they always have inflation rates of 3 to 6%, almost regardless of what happens. So per year. So yeah, I've been an inflationista for years. I remain an inflationista. I think we've structurally shifted our inflation regimes. If you look at the US, it used to be that the target was 2% inflation on average over the course of the cycle. Now, the way you listen to Fed directors speak, they're now targeting 2% as a floor on inflation. In Europe, 2% used to be the ceiling, was the target ceiling. We were supposed to hover between 0 and 2. But there again, in Europe, we're now saying, look, 2% will be the floor, not the ceiling anymore. So, yeah, policymakers, as soon as we get even remotely close to that 2%, which is what just occurred in Europe, of course, as you get remotely close to that 2%, central banks will ease, central bank will push cash in. So, yeah, I think we're now across the Western world in a structurally higher inflation environment.
Okay. And then if we go to China, which is actually probably one of the countries that has had, not much inflation and even deflation. You mentioned previously that you thought that it had bottomed at the start. You were saying maybe that's not the case. So I guess what is your current outlook? Do you still think potentially economically it's troughed and now we're going to see a boom?
So look, I think there's two super important trends in China right now. The first trend, the one that you keep reading about in the FT and the Economist and the Wall Street Journal and whatever financial media you choose to spend your time with, is the continued unfolding balance sheet recession. If you look at the past 3-4 years, Chinese stock prices have gone down by 2/3 from their highs. Chinese real estate is down anywhere from 25 to 50%, depending on the city. Now, I want you to imagine that you're living in the UK and the FTSE 100 was down 2/3, and price of real estate in London was down 25%, and price of real estate in Northampton and Ipswich and Bath was down by 2/3. By 50%. 50%. This is what's happened in China. So imagine that this happened in the UK. Where do you think car sales would be? Where do you think restaurant sales would be, or movie ticket sales? I would venture that they'd be at zero. That kind of a balance sheet recession, it would have blown everybody, out of the water. Now, what's fascinating in China, so you've had this in the backdrop. China has just experienced a hell of a balance sheet recession. But it's basically the economy's come through this test of fire, not unscathed, of course. There's been a lot of bodies along the way and a lot of victims of this test by fire, but the economy did not implode because simultaneously you had a second trend. Just as the government told the banks, don't lend to property developers anymore, the government also said to banks, go ahead and lend as much as you want to automakers, solar panel makers, telecom switch manufacturers, anybody doing anything in industry or in tech, they can get access to loans. And so that brings me to everybody in the Western world focuses on the real estate and the balance sheet recession. And meanwhile, perhaps the more important macro trend is the fact that China is now basically leapfrogging us in industry after industry. They're producing better cars for cheaper. They're producing better tractors for cheaper. They're producing better nuclear power plants for cheaper, better high-speed rail for cheaper, and so on and so forth. And so this is a super, super important trend. And what's fascinating to me is most Western investors will want to talk all day whether Shanghai real estate prices are going to go down or up another 10%, which really isn't going to impact their lives. And it's at this point, it's no longer going to impact the markets. At this point, it only matters if you own Shanghai real estate or if you're thinking of buying it. Meanwhile, 2 weeks ago, BYD released a new BYD Chin car, a car with a 2,000. It's a hybrid car that can do 2,000 kilometers on one tank of gas. So you can drive from London to Rome and never have to refill. Now, this car is revolutionary. You can question whether it's going to bury and just kill off the entire electric vehicle industry, because what's the point of buying an electric vehicle and deal with the range anxiety and the recharging times, etc., when you have a hybrid that is so efficient that it uses so little gas, 3 liters per 100 kilometers. It uses so little gas that it's like, okay, the pollution impact of this thing is really fairly marginal. So it's and now here's the fascinating thing: is this car is sold for 100,000 renminbi. That's $14,000 US. And it's in my mind, it's now the best car in the market. So we should be talking all day about this. This car is going to upend one of the most important industries in most Western industrial countries. But instead, we talk about Shanghai real estate, which is now no longer that important. Now, this is all a very long-winded answer to your question, but when you look at China, I think because we've all focused on the real estate story, people are too negative. People are waking up to actually the positive story about China, which is the moving up on the supply chain. Now, granted, as China moves up on the value chain, as it becomes a more and more efficient industrial producer, you also don't get you don't get inflation. And I'll finish. I know I'm long-winded, but I'll finish with this BYD Chin story because it's so telling about the evolution of the Chinese auto industry and the Chinese economy in general. If you go back to 2008, when BYD launched its first car, it was the first BYD Chin. It's like a Toyota Corolla. They just do different models over time. The models evolve, but when they did the BYD Chin in 2008, the car if you were working at BYD, you were earning 11 renminbi an hour. That was your wages. And it would take you 110 months to buy the car. Fast forward today, so 2014, so sort of 15 years later, 2024, apologies, 2024, sort of 15 years later, the new BYD Chin, the workers working at BYD get paid 70 renminbi an hour. So their wages have gone up more than 6 times over the course of this period. And here's the fascinating story. It now takes a worker less than 10 months to buy the car. So you've gone from 110 months to buy the car to less than 10 months, which is why, if you look at China, in spite of this massive balance sheet recession, you still have car sales at all-time highs, and you still have restaurant sales at all-time highs and movie ticket sales at all-time highs, because wages have still managed to go up, and they've gone up a fair amount, and so the consumption hasn't completely fallen out of bed.
Okay, that's really interesting. Yeah, thanks for explaining that. So, did you see? Will they have to be a bit smarter with how they've? I guess because there's concern from the West that there's subsidies from the China government for a lot of these industries. Do they need to be? Do you think they'll have to be more careful in terms of how they encourage these industries, or do you think it's just going to be massive tariffs being put on them moving forward? How do you see that, I guess, dynamic changing in the future?
So at first, I'd say I think they've been pretty smart. Deng Xiaoping's advice when he left, when he was getting old and he could feel that his days were numbered, his advice to the Chinese leaders was to basically bide your time, don't overpromise, and most importantly, hide your cards. Don't show your power, don't show our strength, and remain hidden. Now, again, if you look at the past 5 years, all you've had in the Western media was stories about how China's imploding, the bad demographics, the youth unemployment, the ghost cities, the real estate, etc. And meanwhile, they were growing by leaps and bounds in industry. So now all of a sudden we wake up to the fact that they're producing much better cars for half the cost. And yes, the policy response in the world, in the Western world, is fairly predictable. The only thing we can do is reach for the weapons of tariffs. So we're going to tariff Chinese cars, but fundamentally that means that you're not really punishing Chinese producers as much as you're punishing Western consumers. Now, here's the important part: is the Western world is doing this at a time when exports to the Western world no longer matter as much as they used to. They still matter, of course, don't get me wrong. But, if you go back to a decade ago, China's exports to Southeast Asia were less than half of China's exports to the US. Today, China exports 20% more to Southeast Asia than it exports to the US. So Southeast Asia, Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, and so on, as a combined market is now more important to China than the US. So I highlight this because, yes, the Western world will do protectionism, but it won't hurt China as much as it would have just again 5 years ago, 10 years ago. And on this, cars again are a terrific example. From nowhere 5 years ago, China is now the biggest car exporter in the world. But all these Chinese cars, you don't really see them. You see them a little bit, but you don't see them massively on the streets of Europe. You definitely don't see them on the streets of the United States. Where you see them is on the streets of Brazil, on the streets of Chile, on the streets of Indonesia or Saudi Arabia. So what China's managed to do, I think, is build proper big markets for its products across the emerging world, which at the end of the day is going to be the growing part of the world for the next 10, 20 years because of demographics, because of catch-up consumption, because of a number of factors. So, yeah, I think, look, you can't hide the fact that you're producing a better car for cheaper. Now, it all comes down to whether the European policymakers and U.S. policymakers accept that China produces a better car for cheaper and that their constituents are thus allowed to benefit from these cheap Chinese cars, or whether their constituents need to be punished for the Chinese productivity gains and not get an opportunity to participate in it.
Yeah, and historically we see these tariffs actually are pretty bad for the companies that they're trying to protect because they produce innovation. Yeah, so it means that the product's there's going to be such a big divide. Yep.
Do you really think? Look at the U.S. Do you really think that Chrysler is going to produce a better car now because they're protected by tariffs, or do you think they're going to produce a worse car? I think that the question, it's a pretty obvious answer.
Yeah, definitely. So the Chinese currency, the yuan, is also been in the spotlight as well because it's, I guess, depreciated quite a lot against the US dollar as well as other currencies. I was there and I was surprised by how
against the US dollar, not against other currencies. It's close to all-time highs against the yen, close to all-time highs against the yuan. If you look at the renminbi,
if we'd say like the euro and the pound, and
not even the euro. I mean, the euro where. But not even, it's really against the dollar. I mean, the dollar's been strong against everybody, right? I mean, the Aussie dollar went from parity to 65 cents. The euro went from 150 down to we're at 107. All-time low for the well, not all time, but the past 20-year low on the euro is 105. We're not that far off. Every currency's been weak. The renminbi has actually been, amongst all the world's major currencies, has been perhaps one of the least weak one against the US dollar. So renminbi has been weak against the US dollar, but honestly, it's not been weak against all these other currencies. The currency that's been massively, massively weak, that is the big anomaly in the world, is really the Japanese yen. The Japanese yen is 40% undervalued on a purchasing parity basis. In the past 3 years, the yen, or the past 4 years, the yen's gone from 110 to 160. That's been the big currency move. And for me, that's mostly what explains the Chinese renminbi, relative weakness. Because if you're China and 5 years ago you make the bet of saying, what, we're going to grow through industry. Our bank's just going to lend to industry. We're done with the real estate story. No more loans to real estate. we're putting all our eggs in the industry basket, then the one way you get screwed in that strategy is if the other massive industrial producer in the world, i.e. Japan, devalues its currency by 30 or 40% and makes itself massively, massively competitive in the process. And this is, of course, precisely what's happened. A yen at 160 is a genuine problem for any industrial producer anywhere in the world.